In 1943, American pilots flew into German skies, outnumbered, outgunned, and flying an aircraft so big they called it the flying milk jug. But what the enemy didn't know was that this beast could dive faster than gravity itself. At over 500 miles per hour, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt became a bullet from the heavens, rewriting air combat and turning fear into firepower. This is the story of how one misunderstood fighter and one brilliant commander turned the tide of war and achieved the impossible, a 19-to-1 kill ratio. In early 1943, the skies over Europe were filled with death. Every day, hundreds of American bombers crossed into enemy territory, flying through walls of flak and swarms of German fighters. The Luftwaffe owned the air. Its Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs cut into bomber formations like wolves attacking helpless prey. The men of the 8th Air Force watched their friends vanish in flames and smoke, knowing they had little protection. The United States needed a savior in the sky, and it arrived in the shape of a huge, ugly, overweight airplane called the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. When the Thunderbolt first appeared in England, many pilots laughed. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, or worse, the flying milk jug. It was massive, heavy, and drank fuel like a monster. It couldn't climb fast, and it looked nothing like the sleek, elegant Spitfires the British flew. But inside that enormous frame was a secret: the most powerful piston engine of World War II, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, a 2,000 horsepower beast with a turbocharger system unlike anything the Germans had ever faced. The R-2800 allowed the Thunderbolt to dive faster than any aircraft of its time. In level flight, the German Bf-109 and FW-190 could match or beat it, but once the Jug pointed its nose down, physics took over, and the P-47 became a lightning bolt. In spring 1943, Colonel Hubert Zemke took command of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke was a hard, sharp man, a perfectionist. He had studied German flight tactics before the war and knew the Luftwaffe fought differently. Tight formations, aggressive climbs, head-on attacks. Zemke understood something his peers didn't: that the Thunderbolt's size wasn't a weakness. It was armor. It was energy. And if used correctly, it could dominate the sky through speed, altitude, and discipline. Zemke began transforming his pilots. He ordered them to climb higher than the bombers, up to 30,000 feet where the air was thin and cold. From there, they could see German fighters rising from below to attack the bomber streams. The P-47s would not dogfight. They would not chase. They would strike and disappear. The tactic was called boom and zoom. Zemke taught his men to dive straight down at over 500 miles per hour, a speed that shattered the air around the Jug's wings. At that velocity, the Luftwaffe fighters could not follow. Their airframes would shake apart. Even if they tried, their engines couldn't keep up in the dive. The Thunderbolt's weight and its massive engine gave it a deadly advantage: momentum. It was a brutal, physics-driven form of aerial warfare. The P-47 would dive like a spear, unleash 8 50 caliber machine guns in a few seconds of blinding fire, then pull up hard, using the leftover energy to climb back into the clouds. From there, the pilot would reposition, find another target, and strike again. It was not elegant like the turning duels of early war dogfights. It was scientific, a cold, precise exploitation of gravity and energy. At first, many pilots resisted the idea. They wanted to fight like knights, circling and twisting with the enemy. Zemke forbade it. "Don't dogfight a 190, he said. "Hit him once and climb. Let gravity be your co-pilot." Among his men was Francis Gabby Gabreski, a Polish-American pilot with a fiery temper and unmatched reflexes. He quickly mastered Zemke's new doctrine. Gabreski learned to read the sky like a hunter. He would climb, stalk, dive, and kill in seconds. Another was Robert S. Johnson, a quiet Oklahoman whose calm patience made him deadly. Together, they formed the backbone of the 56th, the Wolfpack. In their first missions over France, the P-47s protected bomber formations headed for Rouen and Saint-Nazaire. The Luftwaffe came in waves, attacking from above and below. The Jug pilots followed Zemke's plan. They stayed high, waited, then dove through the chaos like falling meteors. German pilots were shocked. They couldn't catch them in the dives, and they couldn't climb fast enough to intercept them on the way up. On one mission, Gabreski scored his first victory by diving from 30,000 feet straight at a FW-190 that was about to hit a bomber formation. He fired a 1-second burst, 2,400 bullets per minute, and the German fighter exploded. Gabreski zoomed back into the clouds untouched. He had spent just 8 seconds in combat. Robert Johnson's experience showed the Thunderbolt's durability. In June 1943, during a mission near Rouen, his P-47 was hit by cannon fire from a FW-190. Fuel leaked, the canopy was shattered, and his controls jammed. But the massive airframe held together. Johnson barely managed to steer home, escorted by a Spitfire. When his plane landed, mechanics counted 21 holes and 4 20mm cannon hits, yet the Jug had survived. Word spread quickly. The Thunderbolt could take punishment that would destroy any other fighter. It became a legend, a flying tank that refused to die. By late 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had refined its tactics to perfection. Zemke insisted on coordinated attacks, 4-ship elements that struck together always from altitude. Communication was everything. The radio calls echoed through the clouds. Bandits 2 o'clock low. Dive, dive. Engines roared. Air screamed across wings, and the Jugs dropped like stones. In seconds, the Germans were forced to break their attacks on the bombers and defend themselves. The Luftwaffe couldn't believe what was happening. They were losing experienced pilots at an alarming rate. The Thunderbolt's machine guns, firing armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, tore apart enemy aircraft. The P-47's heavy wings could carry over 3,000 rounds of ammunition, enough for long, sustained bursts. The numbers told the story. By the end of 1943, Zemke's 56th had destroyed over 400 German aircraft in the air and on the ground, for the loss of fewer than 25 of their own, a kill ratio close to 20-1. Behind those numbers were stories of bravery, discipline, and cold calculation. Every pilot knew one mistake in a dive could mean death. At 500 mph, control surfaces stiffened. The plane vibrated violently and the earth rushed up faster than the brain could think. Many times, pilots blacked out during the pull-up, trusting instinct and training to save them. But the Thunderbolt's strength, its weight and structure, saved many lives. It could withstand the stress of these dives, even as the air screamed and the wings shuddered. Zemke's method spread across the 8th Air Force. Other groups adopted the dive and zoom combat doctrine. The P-47, once mocked as too big and too slow, had become the deadliest predator over Europe. Still, the cost was high. The bomber stream stretched deeper into Germany, beyond the Thunderbolt's range. Pilots often had to turn back before the bombers reached their targets. They would watch helplessly as the formations continued into hell, unescorted. Zemke fought for auxiliary fuel tanks, drop tanks, that could extend the P-47's reach. He won that battle too. With external tanks, the Thunderbolt began to escort bombers to Berlin. The change was dramatic. In late 1943 and early 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. German commanders began to notice a terrifying pattern. The Americans were fighting with mathematics. Their tactics were systematic, efficient, and merciless. Every boom and zoom strike saved lives, conserved energy, and destroyed enemy morale. But Zemke's genius wasn't only in tactics, and it was in psychology. He understood his pilots needed to believe in their machine. So he flew with them. He proved that the Thunderbolt could dive faster, climb higher, and survive harder than any opponent. In one mission over Emden, Zemke's group encountered a swarm of FW-190s. The Germans tried to trap them by climbing above the bomber stream. Zemke led his men in a steep dive from 32,000 feet. The P-47 screamed through the formation, guns blazing. 4 FW-190s went down in seconds. The rest scattered. The bombers made it home safely. That night, Zemke walked through the dispersal area, greeting every pilot. He wasn't smiling, he rarely did, but the men could see pride in his eyes. The legend of the Wolfpack was born. The P-47 became more than a fighter. It was a symbol of American power, engineering, and adaptation. Its turbocharged engine allowed it to climb where few could breathe. At 30,000 feet, the exhaust gases from the engine were rerouted through a complex system of ducts, spinning a turbine that compressed fresh air back into the cylinders. The Germans had nothing like it. Their superchargers lost power at high altitude. That difference, while mechanical and invisible, gave the Thunderbolt its dominance. By early 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, the Thunderbolt was everywhere. It strafed trains, bombed airfields, attacked convoys, and still managed to fight off the Luftwaffe. Its 850 caliber guns ripped through locomotives, tanks, and even ships. German troops began to call it the Jug, not with mockery, but with fear. Even though sleeker fighters like the P-51 Mustang were arriving, many pilots chose to stay with their P-47s. They trusted its armor and firepower more than anything else in the sky. Gabreski once said, "She may not climb like a Spitfire, but she'll get you home when a Spitfire wouldn't." That was the heart of the Thunderbolt: survivability. In the months leading to Operation Point Blank, the Allied air campaign to destroy the German aircraft industry, the 56th Fighter Group continued to refine its deadly art. Zemke's men coordinated large-scale dives, hitting Luftwaffe squadrons from multiple directions. The Germans were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outthought. For every American pilot lost, 10 Germans fell. Still, the war was far from over. Deep inside Germany, the factories of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf continued to churn out fighters. The Luftwaffe was desperate. Young, inexperienced pilots replaced the veterans who had perished in the skies of France. Zemke's Wolfpack could sense it. The Germans were getting slower, less organized, more fearful. But that didn't make the missions easier. The air over Germany was a frozen battlefield, filled with smoke trails, burning planes, and falling men. Every sortie meant facing death, not just from fighters, but from anti-aircraft guns that lined the coast. And yet, as 1944 approached, something had changed. For the first time, American bombers were reaching their targets and returning in force. The tide in the air war was turning. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the milk jug once mocked by all, had become the weapon that made it possible. By January 1944, the air war over Europe had entered a new phase. The Allied command had one goal: total destruction of the Luftwaffe. Without German air defenses, the coming invasion of France could succeed. But first, the Americans had to win control of the sky. The 8th Air Force launched Operation Point Blank, a massive bombing campaign against German aircraft factories, fuel depots, and assembly plants. The plan was simple on paper: cripple the Luftwaffe before D-Day. But in reality, every bomber that crossed the channel was flying into a storm of flak and fighters. Colonel Hubert Zemke knew what was coming. The Wolfpack had already earned its reputation, the most efficient killer group in the 8th Air Force. But now, they would face the full weight of Germany's defense. In early February, American bombers began to hit key targets like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Leipzig. These were the heart of the German war machine, factories that built the Bf-109s and Fw-190s. Every time the bombers went out, hundreds of enemy fighters rose to stop them. And above those bombers, waiting like hawks, were the P-47s. Zemke's pilots had perfected their dive and zoom tactics. They now worked in large coordinated formations, using altitude and teamwork to strike from unexpected angles. Instead of circling over the bombers, they spread wide across the sky, an invisible web ready to collapse on any German that climbed too high. Each pilot knew his role. The top cover, flying at 30,000 feet, was the killer section. Their job was to hunt. The middle cover stayed around bomber altitude to break up attacks. The low cover dove after any German trying to escape. It was a ballet of speed, discipline, and radio calls. On February 20th, 1944, the first day of what became known as Big Week, the 56th Fighter Group climbed into the freezing dawn over England. The mission: escort B-17s deep into Germany and smash the Luftwaffe's production network. At 25,000 feet, contrails stretched across the blue like white scars. German radar picked up the raid, and soon black dots began to rise from the east. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, climbing in tight spirals to reach the bombers. Wolfpack. Bandits at 2 o'clock, 10 miles, climbing fast. Zemke's voice came through the radio, calm but hard. All elements, dive now. The sky exploded. Thunderbolts rolled over, their noses pointing almost straight down. The roar of their engines filled the air. At over 500 miles per hour, the P-47s screamed through the German formations like meteors. 8 50-caliber guns tore through the thin aluminum of the enemy fighters. German pilots tried to follow, and failed. Their wings shook, control surfaces froze, and several aircraft simply disintegrated under the strain. Those who tried to pull out too late vanished into the clouds below. Within minutes, the sky was clear. The bombers continued toward their targets. That day, the Wolfpack claimed 17 enemy fighters for the loss of 1 Thunderbolt. It was only the beginning. Over the next 5 days, the 8th Air Force sent wave after wave of bombers into Germany. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense, more than 2,000 fighters. But they were met by a wall of Thunderbolts and the newly arrived P-51 Mustangs. Zemke's men worked with mathematical precision. They no longer fought for glory. They fought to destroy the enemy's ability to fight. Each engagement was timed, coordinated, and ruthless. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 500 fighters. The Americans had lost fewer than 100. The balance of power in the air had shifted forever. But the cost for Zemke's pilots was rising. Every mission meant hours in the cockpit, frozen fingers, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. Even the strongest men were starting to break. Robert S. Johnson, now one of the top aces of the group, had faced death more than once. On one mission, he found himself trapped beneath a cloud deck, his oxygen failing, when a lone FW-190 appeared behind him. The German riddled his Thunderbolt with cannon fire. Johnson's cockpit filled with smoke, his engine sputtered, and his elevator jammed. But somehow the jug stayed in the air. Johnson kept flying, taking hit after hit, until the German pilot finally ran out of ammunition and saluted before turning away. Johnson made it home again. The Thunderbolt had saved him. Zemke used stories like this to remind his pilots of their machine's strength. "Gentlemen," he told them, "trust your jug. She'll take you down, and she'll bring you back." The P-47 was not just surviving the war, it was evolving. Engineers at Republic Aviation continued to improve it. New versions like the P-47D-22 came with bubble canopies for better visibility, paddle blade propellers for faster climbs, and increased fuel capacity. With 2 drop tanks, a Thunderbolt could now reach Berlin and back, a mission that had been impossible only months earlier. This new range allowed the Wolfpack to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. They could now pursue the Luftwaffe to its home bases. The hunting ground had changed. Instead of waiting for the Germans to attack the bombers, Zemke began offensive sweeps, independent fighter patrols that searched for enemy aircraft on the ground and in the air. The Thunderbolt's firepower made it perfect for the job. Its 8 heavy guns could shred trains, trucks, and airfields. In one sweep over northern France, Gabreski led his flight low over a German airbase. He spotted several FW-190s parked on the runway. The jugs dove from 5,000 feet, guns blazing. The first pass destroyed 3 aircraft. The second wrecked the hangars, and by the third, the entire field was burning. When they returned to base, Gabreski's gun barrels were scorched. The results of these missions were devastating. German fuel convoys stopped moving in daylight. Trains were abandoned, bridges bombed, and communication lines shattered. The Luftwaffe's logistics collapsed under constant attack. But success brought new challenges. In the spring of 1944, the Allies began preparing for D-Day, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Air superiority was crucial. If the Luftwaffe could disrupt the invasion fleet, thousands of lives would be lost. The Thunderbolt's mission shifted again: destroy the enemy on the ground before the first Allied soldier set foot on the beach. The Wolfpack launched hundreds of sorties across northern France. They bombed radar stations, strafed transport columns, and cut rail lines. The P-47 could carry bombs under its wings, 2 500-pounders or a single 1,000-pound bomb, turning it into a deadly fighter bomber. It was no longer just a sky predator. It was a weapon of total war. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops landed in Normandy, the Thunderbolts were already overhead. They flew nearly 2,000 missions that day, destroying German vehicles, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. Any enemy convoy that tried to move during daylight was hit by jugs diving from the sun. German soldiers began to call them Thunderbolts of Hell. In the days that followed, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. The Luftwaffe's presence grew weaker and weaker. Many of its airfields were bombed beyond use. Those few who tried to fight were met by P-47s diving straight down from impossible heights. Even the German aces, men with dozens of victories, began to realize the war in the air was lost. In one encounter, Zemke's group met a formation of FW-190s near Paris. Instead of the usual swirling dogfight, the Thunderbolts attacked in perfect unison. The Germans had no time to react. Within 4 minutes, 10 enemy aircraft were gone. Not one American was lost. The kill ratio that day was 20-0. It wasn't luck. It was training, physics, and leadership. Zemke often said, "The Thunderbolt doesn't win with beauty, it wins with brains." By mid-1944, that truth was visible in every sky over Europe. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was dying, replaced by inexperienced teenagers with barely 100 hours of flight time. Against them were hardened veterans like Gabreski, Johnson, Schilling, and Zemke himself, men who had survived the worst and mastered the art of war in 3 dimensions. For Gabreski, the war had become personal. His family roots were Polish, and he carried the memory of his parents' homeland under Nazi occupation. He fought not just for victory but for revenge. By summer 1944, he was the top American ace in the European theater, with 28 confirmed kills. But even heroes fall. On July 20th, 1944, while strafing a German airfield near Bassenheim, Gabreski's P-47 clipped the ground during a low-level pass. The propeller tore into the dirt and the plane skidded across the runway. Gabreski tried to run but was captured. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in Stalag Luftwaffe. His capture was a heavy blow to the Wolfpack, but his legend lived on. The Germans respected him. The Americans idolized him. Back in England, Zemke continued to lead. The Wolfpack now operated from forward bases in France, following the advancing Allied armies. Their missions became shorter, deadlier, and more frequent. They attacked tanks, artillery, and convoys, paving the way for ground forces. The P-47 had become the workhorse of the Allied air campaign. Its heavy armor allowed it to absorb ground fire. Its rugged engine survived damage that would kill any other plane, and its versatility made it indispensable. It could escort, bomb, strafe, and fight all in one day. The Luftwaffe was broken. German pilots avoided combat whenever possible. Fuel shortages grounded many squadrons. By the fall of 1944, the Americans controlled the air completely. And yet, Zemke was never satisfied. He believed the true measure of a fighter pilot was not how many enemies he shot down, but how many bombers he brought home safely. That philosophy defined the Wolfpack's legacy. As autumn came, the skies over Europe began to clear. The Thunderbolts, scarred and worn, returned to base one by one. Mechanics patched bullet holes, replaced engines, and sent them out again. There was always another mission, another target, another dive. The war was shifting toward its final act. The German army was retreating, its factories burning, its cities in ruins. But the Luftwaffe still had one card left: the jet fighter. In late 1944, Allied pilots began to report sightings of a strange new aircraft, faster than anything they had seen before. It was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It could reach speeds of over 540 miles per hour, faster than any piston-engine aircraft in the world. For the first time, the Thunderbolt's legendary dive speed might not be enough. But Zemke and his pilots were ready to adapt again. By late 1944, the thunder over Europe was changing. The Allied armies were advancing across France, and the sky above them belonged to the Americans. Yet in the final months of the war, a new sound echoed through the clouds, a high-pitched scream unlike any propeller ever made. It was the sound of the jet age. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, had arrived. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it could outrun anything the Allies had. With speeds above 540 miles per hour, it entered combat at a time when the Luftwaffe was dying, but not yet finished. For the Thunderbolt pilots who had mastered the dive and zoom war, the appearance of the Me-262 was both thrilling and terrifying. They knew they could not chase it in level flight. But Colonel Hubert Zemke and his Wolfpack had learned long ago that victory didn't always come from speed alone. It came from thinking ahead, from using altitude, teamwork, and timing. Zemke studied the new threat carefully. Reports showed the German jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when their engines needed long runways and slow acceleration. He changed his group's tactics again. Instead of waiting high above the bombers, he sent his Thunderbolts to patrol near jet bases, diving on them as they climbed or returned to land. The Thunderbolt's heavy guns and rugged frame made it perfect for ambushes. In one mission near Akmer, P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group caught several Me-262s as they came into land. The American pilots dived from 15,000 feet, firing short bursts. 2 jets were destroyed before they touched the runway. The rest scattered into the woods. The world's fastest fighter had been brought down by the world's toughest. Meanwhile, the war on the ground was raging toward Germany's borders. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final desperate offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Allied troops were trapped in the freezing forests of Belgium, surrounded by German armor. Once again, the Thunderbolts became the hammer of the Allied war machine. When the weather cleared, waves of P-47s roared over the Ardennes. They struck columns of tanks, supply trucks, and artillery. Their bombs and rockets shattered bridges and convoys, halting the German advance. Many pilots flew 4 or 5 missions a day, their faces blackened with oil and smoke. For the men on the ground, the sound of the Jug's engine meant salvation. Soldiers cheered as the big fighters screamed overhead, diving nearly straight down to deliver their payloads. The same physics that had won the sky was now saving lives on the battlefield. Robert S. Johnson later wrote, "When you saw a thunderbolt coming out of the sun, you knew somebody on the ground was going to live a little longer." The P-47 had become more than a fighter. It was an airborne tank, a guardian angel, and a symbol of American firepower. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded many of its jets. Young, inexperienced pilots faced veterans who had survived hundreds of missions. The Wolfpack continued to fly daily, attacking trains, depots, and any aircraft that dared to rise. On one of his last missions, Colonel Zemke himself was shot down after his engine failed over Germany. He bailed out and was captured, spending the final weeks of the war as a prisoner. Even in captivity, he continued to lead, organizing American airmen into disciplined units and keeping morale alive until liberation. The end was near. In April 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine. The skies were clear of German fighters. The remaining P-47 units now turned to destroying anything that moved behind enemy lines. Bridges, trucks, and railroads vanished under their guns. When word came that Hitler was dead and Germany had surrendered, many Thunderbolt pilots were still in the air. They returned to their bases in silence, engines rumbling, unsure how to feel. They had won the war, but at a heavy price. More than 3,500 P-47s had been lost in combat across Europe, but they had destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft and tens of thousands of vehicles, tanks, and trains. The average kill ratio of Zemke's 56th Fighter Group stood at 19-1, one of the highest in military aviation history. For the men who flew them, the Thunderbolt was not just a machine. It was a living, breathing beast, rough, loud, and loyal. It brought them home when nothing else could. In the months after the war, many pilots said farewell to their beloved Jugs. Sleeker fighters like the P-51 Mustang and new jets would take their place. But none of them forgot the heavy roar of the R-2800, the deep hum that meant survival. The P-47 had been mocked when it arrived, called clumsy, overweight, and slow. Yet by the war's end it was feared, respected, and immortalized. Its story was one of transformation from ridicule to legend, from brute force to tactical genius. Historians later said that Zemke's boom and zoom tactics rewrote the manual of air combat. They proved that altitude and energy could defeat maneuverability, that physics, not luck, decided battles in the sky. These lessons would shape every jet fighter doctrine that followed, from Korea to modern aerial warfare. When asked years later how his group had achieved such impossible kill ratios, Zemke answered simply, "We stopped fighting the enemy's fight. We started fighting the laws of nature, and we made them our allies. The Thunderbolt was not beautiful, but it was pure. It represented the industrial strength, ingenuity, and courage of the United States in its most desperate hour. From the early days of 1943, when pilots mocked it on the tarmac, to the spring of 1945, when its shadow crossed the Rhine, the P-47 proved that determination and adaptation could change the course of war. Francis Gabreski survived his captivity and returned home a hero. Robert S. Johnson became one of the most respected instructors in post-war aviation. Hubert Zemke, the man who turned a heavy fighter into a legend, lived to see jet aircraft carry his ideas into the future. And the Thunderbolt, the Jug, continued to serve in the years after the war, flying with allied nations around the world. Its deep roar echoed across Europe, the Pacific, and later Korea. Wherever it flew, people looked up and remembered what it had meant. It had been the protector of the bombers, the scourge of the Luftwaffe, and the hammer that broke the German war machine. Its pilots had faced the enemy, gravity, and fear itself, and won. As the sun set over the fields of England where the 56th Fighter Group once launched its missions, the wind still seemed to carry the sound of engines diving out of the clouds. And in that distant thunder, you can almost hear the voice of Zemke, calm and steady, saying once more, "Dive straight down and trust your Jug."